This is the lecture for Thursday, October the 1st, 2020. This is the beginning of Lesson 7. So in 1782, Great Britain signed the Treaty of Paris of 1782. Now, of course, the main provision of the treaty said that the 13 colonies were now free and independent states. The treaty also announced that the western boundary of the United States would be the Mississippi River. Now, how far north we would go, how far south we would go, that was sort of a bone of contention. The treaty further required the new state government of the United States to compensate property that was taken from the Loyalists. Now, the Articles of Confederation quickly agreed that they were not going to do this, even though we agreed to it in the treaty. The new government of the United States would be called the Articles of Confederation. Now, each state would be allowed to send representatives to the Articles of Confederation Congress. Now, we're going to skip over this video because I'm afraid it might get us banned on YouTube. Now, how many representatives is each state going to send? Well, honestly, that is determined by each state. Each state would send as many representatives or as few representatives as they wanted. But what is important to put in your notes is each state would only get one vote. So if you were the state of Georgia and you sent one person, and if you were from South Carolina and you sent a gajillion people, South Carolina would only get one vote. Georgia would only get one vote. Now, in the Articles of Confederation Congress, laws would be discussed. Should we do this? Should we do that? And if passed, the laws would be implemented. All we needed was a simple majority. So if you have 13 states, all you need are 7 states to agree with the bill proposed in the Articles of Confederation Congress. After the law was passed, each state would have to determine if they were going to enforce it. So let's say that the Articles of Confederation Congress says that every kid who goes to a Catholic high school has to wear purple tennis shoes on Tuesdays. Well, after it had been passed, each of the states would have to decide. If, say, one state wanted to enforce it, the other state didn't want to enforce it, well, that's up to the state. There was no national leader to direct the 13 states. There was no national court system to settle disputes between the various states. The power of the country, therefore, lied in the hands of state government. Each state was encouraged to write a new constitution based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. These state constitutions were to make sure that individual freedoms were guaranteed. Now, 2 of the last states to draw up their state constitution was Virginia and Massachusetts. Now, both of these states took great care to write out a list of individual freedoms, or what Virginia and Massachusetts called a Bill of Rights. Now, it is important to remember that the Massachusetts Constitution was written by John Adams. Now, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the 2 framers of our Declaration of Independence, will both be off in Europe as ambassadors when the Constitution is created 5 years after this. With the conclusion of the Revolution, the Articles of Confederation Congress had several problems to figure out. The first problem to figure out was what to do with the land and the residents on the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, already 3 large areas had been established with large populations. What should happen to these areas? Well, there were those in the Articles of Confederation Congress who said that the states that are already existing should get to take over these areas. There were others who said no, that these should become new states. Now, none of the 13 states wanted to see any of the 13 states enlarge themselves on the Ohio River Valley. So Congress quickly agreed that all of the land west of the Appalachian Mountains should become free states. Now, to accomplish this, the Land Ordinance of 1785 was created. Now, by the way, we still use the Land Ordinance of 1785 when we talk about areas that want to join the United States. Basically, what the Land Ordinance does is it creates a procedure for surveying the various states and how to establish political boundaries. Now, Congress decided to take an area and divide it into sections, and each section would be divided into range and townships. So, for example, you could go to the home you live in, and using the plat of your home, you could determine what section you live in, what range and what township you belong to. Now, each of the range and townships would be divided into equal sections, with the idea that when one section was sold, the money that was made on the sale of this section would be used for the building of a public school building. Now, this is the first time in the history of our country that we have used the expression public schools. The 13 states had all had parochial schools. The Congress then passed the Northwest Ordinance. Now, the Northwest Ordinance called for a receipt of how unincorporated land could be formed into a state. In other words, we know what sections of land we have, how many people before we became a territory, how many people before we could petition for statehood. The Northwest Ordinance said that when an area that was unincorporated achieved a particular number of people, then it could go to Congress and ask to become a territory. Now, each territory would have a governor that is chosen by the Articles of Confederation Congress. Now, when the territory received a particular number of people, beyond that, then they could apply for statehood. And the Articles of Confederation Congress would require them to create a state constitution. Then the Articles of Confederation Congress would vote. And if a majority said yes, then the territory would become a new state. The Northwest Ordinance further stated that any state north of the Ohio River Valley would not be allowed to have slavery. Now, this is important because this is the first time in our history in which slavery is going to be protected by our government. Now, after the Revolution, most of the states north of most of the states north of Maryland decided that they would not have slavery. They outlawed it. The states that were from Maryland south decided to keep slavery. So we continue that onto the Ohio River Valley. Those states north of the Ohio River Valley would be devoid of slavery. Those south of the Ohio River Valley would have slavery. Congress, however, could not solve some problems. Congress believed that government should be run off the money from tariffs that were collected by people who brought goods into each individual state. Yet who is going to collect these duties? There was no provisions for any type of Articles of Confederation government to collect these. Congress did not have a national army. Each state was expected to make its state militia available when troops were needed. Now, of course, in 1782, the biggest threat was that of Native Americans. Congress created a national tariff, but each state could set its own tariffs, Well, what happens if the state tariff for New York was greater than what we would call the national tariff? Which tariff should be enforced? And I'm assuming that the state of New York will have to collect its own tariffs and those of the national tariff as well. Navigation of rivers. What happens if a river like the Hudson separates New York from New Jersey? Well, who is going to decide over who's going to be allowed to navigate the Hudson River? Do we have to have a New York license? Do we have to have a New Jersey license? What happens when the residents of one state want to file suit against the resident of another state? Which court system do we use? Now again, the idea is pretty simple. I bought a chicken from Mr. Smith who lives in an adjoining state. He said this chicken was in good order and laid lots of eggs. Well, I got the chicken to my home and the chicken dropped dead. I want my money back. The man in the other state won't give me my money back. I tell him I'm going to sue. Well, sue. Am I going to sue in my state? And if my state says I can collect damages, can I then go to the other state and collect damages? If I sue in the other state and they say I have no standing, what am I supposed to do? Well, tomorrow we're going to look at how another problem is going to tear the Articles of Confederation Congress apart, and we're going to look at some of the solutions to the problems.